Released in 2008, Meet Dave is quite possibly one of the worst movies I've ever seen. It's ironic because one of the writers for the film was Bill Corbett of Mystery Science Theater 3000, which, while that show was not one of the best ever written in terms of the sketches in between, uh, you know, the riffs on the movies, uh, the film itself just it is full of some very awful writing, some very predictable stuff, some very generic plot lines. Um, Meet Dave stars Eddie Murphy and is is quite simply on par with The Adventures of Pluto Nash in that uh, it essentially has Eddie Murphy in it, but he is not doing anything that is typical of Eddie Murphy. He's uh, basically just playing the part rather than um, rather than actually being the kind of characters um, that we've come to enjoy him as. Um, the smart mouthed, clever, um, and witty uh, Axel Foley was, obviously his biggest, greatest role. But by the time he got to Beverly Hills Cop 3, he couldn't really uh, continue doing that work. And of course, the various film projects he did, such as Coming to America, um, 48 Hours, Another 48 Hours, and oh, what's the Trading Places, um, among others, were ones where he could not continue doing the same parts over and over, forever and ever. Um, the Distinguished Gentleman was um, was also a little bit formulaic in that it was kind of a version of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, um, only with Eddie Murphy playing a bit of a shyster, leading into his transformation as a good person. So the plus side there is that you do see a bit of a transformation. The thing about Meet Dave as a film, though, compared with all of this other stuff in Eddie Murphy's catalog, that puts it on par with Pluto Nash is that Meet Dave is so bad that almost nobody I know saw it. I can't. Nobody I know has seen it to the point where they even talk about it. It is one of the forgettable Eddie Murphy movies that he's done. And this guy, I will compare with Steve Martin a lot because um, in a lot of in a lot of ways they're very similar. They both started out making their break with Saturday Night Live. They were both very popular stage comedians following that. They had a string of hit movies um, through the 1980s. Uh, in the case of Steve Martin, that also started a little bit in the late 70s. And it just kind of continues from there. Excuse me a moment. Anyway, so Meet Dave is about a bunch of small humanoid space aliens um, inside of a spaceship. Now, I have a few problems with this whole concept and how it was implemented. Um, my main issue uh, is uh, first off, these people are tiny and they're coming to Earth to get salt from our oceans. Now, this actually wouldn't be too bad um, because they're actually saying that our oceans have too much salt right now, um, and that it's and that as a result, our freshwater supplies are being greatly reduced partially due to pollution and global warming, and the water is going into the oceans instead of into freshwater bodies and that sort of thing through um, through normal rainfall and groundwater sources. Anyway, so you can kind of get my point there. But so the plot there is really thin. Then on top of that, they've come from a tiny planet, I guess it is, that I don't know. I guess it I guess they evolve very small, but they're very unemotional for some reason, and they didn't develop certain emotional characteristics that um, or cultural characteristics like we did. They see us as savages and so forth and so on. Instead of operating by names, they operate by numbers. It's a bit of a weird thing because culturally it doesn't make sense that a society would advance that quickly, or would advance to the level that they had, you know, an android spaceship um, that was incredibly lifelike and had all kinds of different capabilities, but it somehow, uh, but somehow they never developed any real sense of art, music, culture. Um, One of the big laughs that they try to play heavily. Um, I'm trying to look up the character's name. There it is. Is having the having the comedian Pat Kilbane, who I believe is from Mad TV, who plays number four. Uh, they have him suddenly turn gay, and not only does he realize that he's gay, but he's effeminate, and suddenly he knows how to decorate, and he knows how to do hair, and he likes to dress um, in the manner of a young, effeminate gay male, but not in a way that is I don't know. It just offends, is what it does. Unfortunately, uh, because I know some young gay men and some young effeminate gay men who are not at all like that and would not dress that way, would not act that way. Um, and so it just plays as a stereotype, a caricature. And what sets him on this way is hearing musical theater. That's it. He hears some musical theater and suddenly he realizes that he's gay. And he changes his name to Johnny Dazzle. Yeah. Um, and that's it. That's the entire end route of that humor, of that whole plot point. Um, he helps uh, number three, um, played by Gabrielle Union, to do her hair up really nicely and try and impress the captain, played by Eddie Murphy. And it just strikes me as odd that they would have the ship shaped exactly like the captain. You would think that they would go for someone who, might look a little bit more average. But in this case, since Eddie Murphy was clearly supposed to be the star that was attracting people to see this film, uh, they had to have him play both roles, both the ship and the captain of the ship. Um, I think that it might have been just a little bit better if they had bothered to go with a computer animated version of the crew instead of uh, instead of having live actors replace them. For one thing, you wouldn't have had to build all the sets, and it would have been easier to integrate the CGI um, into the various parts of the ship. You could have had the captain still voiced by that person. And you could have had the characters all still voiced by them, but I think it wouldn't have seemed as robotic. And that was really the problem, was the people who were supposed to be playing these characters who were very robotic in nature inside the ship, um, eventually uh, start to act more human, but they're acting so um, so two dimensional, I guess, is the problem. Um, even Ed Helms, who normally plays actually very, uh, actually a very pleasant and relatable character, even when he's acting like a prick or a stiff guy or something like that. No matter how he plays it, you still kind of see what his motivations are. In this film, he just kind of falls flat, and I don't think that he's particularly proud that he had it on his resume, because he essentially plays the bad guy uh, in this. Um, and there are a lot of really stupid sophomore jokes, like the the um, the officer in charge of the ship's butt is named Lieutenant Cheeks, which, if you pronounce lieutenant in a slightly altered way, slightly semi-traditional way, it's lieutenant, so left cheek um, is the joke. And then at the end, this is not going to spoil the movie for you. Um, number two, uh, played by Ed Helms, uh, the captain says, "Put number two in my butt." It's like, really, a poop joke? So the start of the film kind of is also where I have a bit of a problem. You know, I'm I'm stupefied as to why, um, a rock about the size of a golf ball basically shoots through a kid's window and doesn't obliterate the building. I mean, this rock comes all the way from outer space. Things that come from outer space and fall into Earth's gravity have to reduce their speed. In terms of physics, they have to reduce their speed in order to keep from falling with such high velocity upon impact that they don't leave a giant crater. So, in reality, that kid's bedroom, his whole uh, building possibly would have been destroyed. I mean, you've seen uh, Armageddon and Deep Impact and all these films, and these are supposedly based on reality. Uh, what physicists actually think destruction from falling debris in an occupied area would be like. Um, so in this case, the filmmakers really got that way off because they wanted it to be a magic rock, and it's basically the MacGuffin of the film. Um, there it in a lot of films, it's really easy to sort of identify what the MacGuffin is. And for those who don't know, the MacGuffin is the plot device that sort of starts the story in motion, and it's what everybody wants. In Dude, Where's My Car? It's the continuum transfunctioner. Um, in in a lot of movies, for instance, Psycho, uh, by Alfred Hitchcock, which has which Alfred Hitchcock created the term MacGuffin, apparently, or it's credited to him as the first one to kind of use it, but apparently it's not just his term. Um, it's a very old term. But anyway, the MacGuffin in that is some money that the one woman steals, and then she leaves town, goes out on a deserted stretch of highway, um, checks into the Bates Motel and gets killed. And then the rest of the mystery is finding out what happened to her, all that kind of stuff. So the MacGuffin in this case is something that just continues through, as opposed to just sort of being dropped and not resolved, or sort of tied up at the end as saying, "Oh, well, here it is." Um, but not really having people concerned with it, because if you have a story that's preoccupied with the MacGuffin, then it's not going to be as good a story, I think. It's better when it sort of leads you around and then back to where you started with the MacGuffin. So in this case, the number two and the crew are trying to get this small rock that contains a small metal orb that's going to suck the salt out of the oceans that then the ship and the planet Nil that they come from, and Nil means zero, just for reference's sake, um, can have power. Why salt? Who knows? Who cares? Um, So, they just pick a substance that we have plenty of, basically. And the idea is that it's going to suck up all the water in the world. Um, or, a lot of the water, and we're going to be left without very much water, basically. Um, of course, if it were a tiny, tiny planet, there's a lot of salt in the oceans. There's tons of salt in the Great Salt Lake, and it's surrounded by desert. So they could land outside of Salt Lake City, suck up most of the salt from the Great Salt Lake. People would wonder what happened to it, but that would be presumably plenty of salt. Um, so it just raises a lot of questions in my mind as to what exactly they are after. So the other thing I have a problem with is um, the Statue of Liberty is where the android ship lands. Uh, the ship, the ship lands face first into the dirt, which doesn't really make sense, but it's supposed to be for comedic effect, because then you have the body sticking out of the ground with the feet sticking up and out, and it's not really that funny, but it's supposed to be. Now, at what point are Homeland Security, the National Park Service, um, police, firefighters not showing up? Because I'm pretty sure that the Statue of Liberty has some security, has some patrols. Make sure that people aren't going to do anything nasty to the statue. I mean, this is a post 9/11 world where, on 9/11 2001, there actually was a plot to destroy the Statue of Liberty, as well as the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and all these other things. Um, if I remember correctly, I think that's where the third plane that crashed over Pennsylvania was actually going to be headed. It was going to crash into the Statue of Liberty. So we are left with um, this gaping plot hole. The police don't show up there until the next morning. I'm sorry, but there are police night shifts, and there's reports of an object crashing off off of New York in the statue. No, they would be right out there, I like to think. Um, okay, so aside from that, then they find at the bottom of the hole a face print. They don't find any handprints or footprints, really, just a face print. And it's Eddie Murphy's face, of course. So when they find this, it doesn't occur to them that something weird is up. There's a giant crater that clearly wasn't dug out, but clearly had something land in it. and at the bottom is something in the shape of a face. Okay. And then it just kind of goes downhill from there. Um, Eddie Murphy gets hit right in the middle of the street uh, by uh, by Gina Morrison, played by Elizabeth Banks, and people in New York actually gather around. Now, I have a little bit of a problem with that because they've actually done studies where people were dying in the middle of New York City, with hundreds of people around after being mugged and stabbed, or possibly even shot, and they'd be crawling along and waiting there for hours and finally die without anybody calling help. So, they checked with people and asked them, well, why didn't you call for help? And it was because, well, somebody else figured that, they figured that somebody else would. Now, this woman gets out of her car and checks on him, and he clearly has a broken leg, and then gets up and walks off. And nobody at this point calls 911, or doesn't, bother to call an ambulance. So if people are going to bother to gather around this person, they don't bother to bust out their cell phone and call the ER, call for an ambulance. Um, and so it just kind of escapes me as to how this universe works. Then the woman sees the guy in an alley. His leg is suddenly fine. There's no blood, even though his leg was really bent out of shape. And uh, there could have been bone protruding. He should not be walking, is my point. But he's supposed to be just fine. So they, I don't know. For some reason, she then invites this man into her home, where she lives alone with her child. This is a strange person who's not acting weird, not talking right, and she doesn't suspect for a minute that maybe he's on something. He's getting up and walking away without feeling any pain after having his leg broken after being hit by a car. That screams to me, okay, this guy is on something. So, straight away, I question the whole motive. And all she's offering him is some water. That's it. Not, um, your leg was broken. We should get you a doctor, so that legally she's not conducting a hit and run accident, basically. Um, so yeah, it just fails to be at all believable because these people are not acting at all real. Um, Everything is coming together just a little bit too conveniently for the purposes of the story. Um, the the character they sort of who's tertiary that they sort of have a lot of, even though it's unnecessary, they just give him more scenes than he would seem to require, is Kevin Hart. They have Kevin Hart at the beginning as the person repairing the broken leg, and he's kind of rappelling down uh, from the ear uh, down to the leg to repair it. Then um, later they show him in the mouth, and he's kind of putting up with all this stuff being put in the mouth, water, hot dogs, all this kind of stuff. And throughout the film, they're making constant poop jokes, like uh, when when the ship is in the Gap, um, the store, the Gap. Um, he's literally just pooping money, and that's the joke. They could have him producing it out of his mouth. Um, they could have a little door open on his chest or stomach and have it just shooting out or something like that. But instead, they go with him pooping it. And later on, after he wins a hot dog eating contest, they have him pooping out the hot dogs without showing it. And it's so gross. I mean, it's a disgusting idea. Um, and, obviously the idea is that this is somehow supposed to be funny, but it just falls flat. So, I wind up kind of wondering at what point they felt that these jokes were well written and well executed. Because there's this creative process where they have the raw script and they go through it and they edit it down to what they can do, and then they have plenty of material to do, and then they film it and they decide what they're going to do. This film had plenty of money in its special effects budgets for computer generated effects, but instead of doing that where you have like these cute little animated uh, characters inside the ship, they just build sets and have actors, adult actors who are clearly human and everything, just kind of acting stupidly like aliens. Um, and you could have then done the aliens in a slightly more tasteful way, um, than just having them in gray Star Trek like jumpsuits kind of deal. Um, you could have gotten much more creative with the sets. Um, I mean, admittedly, they clearly tried to go with kind of a theme for the sets, where the sets for the inside of the ship are beige, and the characters all dress in gray, and so the idea is that it's very sterile and clean and unemotional. Um, but that doesn't necessarily make sense. These characters don't have any feelings, so I don't know necessarily what that's all about. But aside from that, I just have I have a lot of issues with this movie because the Kevin Hart character comes back and he jumps out for no reason. I mean, at this point, number two has taken over the ship. Or no, wait. Yeah, yeah. At this point, number two has taken over the ship and put the captain in the brig, and then number three helps the captain break out. And number three is, of course, a beautiful woman. Um, Number three helps the captain break out, and then uh, once number two pilots the ship out of a police station after um, after Kevin Hart's character, number 17, jumps out and lands in a cup of coffee, which of course is then drunk by the one police officer who has been believing that these are aliens the whole time. Um, Happens to be drinking that coffee, and oh look, it's this rowdy little alien guy. Um, I just have a problem where it seems like they tried to create more of a character for Kevin Hart than he necessarily should have been. Because then you get to the very end, and the police officer, um, who pulled him out of the coffee and put him in his pocket and took him to where the ship was going to suck up all the water from Earth. And yeah, this is such a horrible plot. I can't believe I'm saying it. He then puts Dave has like his tongue lower and drop out into a little balcony where the captain and number three are standing on it, and he puts Kevin Hart on it, and they stand there for a second, saying goodbye, bye, and um, it's as if, oh, these are the three characters we've come to love over the last hour and a half, 2 hours. Um, It's like, no, no, we haven't. It's a 90-minute film, so hour and a half. So for the past hour and a half, we have supposed to have come to love these characters, and we're sad to see them go away and say goodbye, but we aren't really. And I think that's the real problem. Is I'm not sad to see them go. I'm not sad to see them leave at all. I'm happy because uh, the ship, Dave Ming Chang, which is what they decide to go with the name, um, is not an endearing character. It The captain is not an endearing character. All of the plot twists are very overly convenient. The two cops don't develop as characters. They're just kind of plot devices where they're looking into this crash site. Um, the kid doesn't even really develop as a character. There's a kid that's the child of the woman um, who hit the ship and had its leg broken. Um, yeah, and of course she's a widow, so there's automatic pity for the widow and the orphan and the single mom trying to raise her son. Um, and there's no real mention of what she does for income in New York City, because New York is an expensive city, and on even on a single person's income, even on a two-person income, it's hard to have enough. But then on top of that, they have uh, they have her somehow able to get by and be an artist. How? I mean, it seems like she's just a mom. Uh, she you never see her painting. You see things she has painted, but you never see her painting. So they leave that kind of out of the story. She's just, oh, she's a woman and she has emotional needs where uh she needs a nice man because she's just focusing on her son, and her son needs a strong male role model to help him uh, stand up to bullies and learn how to fend for himself. And it doesn't work. The son doesn't really gain anything. The wife doesn't really gain anything. The characters seem to gain things, but we haven't really become endeared to the um, to number 3, number 17, and the captain at all. And they're standing there um, as the three black people on the ship, because almost everyone else on the ship is white or Asian or Hispanic. So it's a very multicultural, diverse crew, and yeah, that's and they're supposed to be like the three people that we've come to be endeared to, and they kind of are supposed to represent the emotional core or the three main characters of the story, but they fall flat. And I think that if they were done in CGI, where their characters could have actually had more expression, and I don't know, they could have been like anything in terms of uh, how they looked, in terms of limbs, um, number of eyes, skin color, anything. They could have gone any other route with this film, and in the end, it just falls flat. And I hate to say that, but they stand there as the only three black people on this ship, really, and the rest of the crew is made up of different comedians and character actors, and I'm just like, what is going on? Why are these? Why are we stopping and looking at these people? Because they aren't especially endearing. They aren't. Um, we haven't especially enjoyed watching their antics. You know, I think I think the only part where you're even kind of supposed to be rooting for them is when number two is walking with the ship towards Liberty Island, and um, what is it? The uh, the captain and number three have to go from the sidewalk after they're ejected out through the nose, so it's a booger joke, um, onto the sidewalk, and they have to make their way across Times Square, I think it is, and um, back to the ship, so that they can get the ship back. And it just, I don't know, it just seems to be so cockamamie. It doesn't seem to work. Um, and I don't know, it's just unfortunate. I'm just going to read to you the information from Wikipedia here on the production. It says screenwriter Bill Corbett originally pitched the story for sci-fi.com, the website for the Sci-Fi Channel, which previously aired Mystery Science Theater 3000, where Corbett worked as a writer. The concept was eventually dropped, and Corbett, along with other MST3K alumni, instead developed the online miniseries The Adventures of Edward the Less for the site. And Edward the Less is actually a really good um, show. I've seen the episodes, and it was a really good show. It was apparently just as they were canceling MST3K, and they just decided to uh, produce this little animated show with like still pictures, kind of illustrating a story as a video presentation. It was kind of ahead of its time as a web series, seeing as they didn't really have web series at the time. It was funny. It had a certain amount of slapstick. It had a certain amount um, of writing talent in it. In that it kind of followed this fantasy story, and it was cute, as web series go. So then it goes on to say Corbett later revived the idea for a movie and discussed it with friend and fellow writer Rob Greenberg, who had become his screenwriting partner for the project. And Rob Greenberg has various things. He apparently added some additional material for Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. He's done some directing and writing on various sitcoms, and Meet Dave seems to be his only real movie that he's um, made a major contribution on. Um, so, moving on from that, although both writers acknowledged several other Little People Inside Big People movies had been made in the past, I can't really think of too many. Um, Osmosis Jones. Uh, Herman's Head was a sitcom. Anyway. Corbett thought the aspect of an entire Star Trek like crew operating a human being bore some originality. Okay. During filming, Meet Dave was transferred from Paramount, which released many of Murphy's early films, to 20th Century Fox. Meet Dave was written under the title Starship Dave. I think that would have been a better title. But studio executives insisted on a title change in part because of the poor box office performance of The Adventures of Pluto Nash. Aha! A 2002 science fiction comedy that also starred Eddie Murphy. Corbett said the executives also wanted the title changed because they felt having any semblance of science fiction in the title would isolate a large percentage of audiences. Corbett unsuccessfully argued against changing the title, which he described as beyond generic. Which is true. Um, and giving it a sci-fi edge does not necessarily turn people off. I mean, just look at Galaxy Quest. That film has a cult following, um, with not just sci-fi fans. Um, I mean, there are tons of movies that have a sci-fi edge to things that are still popular. You know, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, The Matrix, um, all have a certain science fiction edge to them that don't necessarily um, don't necessarily uh, discount them from popular mainstream. Um, Tripping the Rift was immensely popular for a long time, and Mystery Science Theater is still popular, even though it has a sci-fi edge to it on both the movies and the sketches in between. So, yeah, 20th Century Fox and Paramount clearly just kind of fell flat there. Anyway, Corbett unsuccessfully argued against changing the title. Okay, and said was repetitive of a comedy released earlier in the year called Meet Bill. Yes, I remember that. I'm sorry, my nose itches like crazy. Which he described as beyond generic and said was repetitive of a comedy released earlier in the year called Meet Bill. Although the project, as it was originally conceived, it appealed to both children and slightly older audiences, the final script aimed for a much more solidly family-based audience. Corbett and Greenberg wrote the original draft and some subsequent drafts, and although they were given the sole writing credit, Corbett said other writers have romped through the script as well, including one unnamed writer who spent 1 week adding material after the final draft was submitted. A large amount of improvising and rewriting was also done on the set, and Corbett and Greenberg had little creative control during filming. Corbett said most of the people they worked with were pleasant, and some of the notes from the studio were helpful, um, but that Meet Dave ultimately suffered from a too many cooks thing, which explains a lot as to why it just doesn't really seem to go for what it starts out with. Filming was expected to begin in March 2007. As of early June, they were filming scenes at the Statue of Liberty in New York City. There was also some filming in early 2007 at an elementary school in Pasadena, California. I should note that the film um, was budgeted with $56 million and only made around $50 million back, so it didn't make back what it cost to make. Meet Dave began receiving criticism and virulence months before it was actually released, especially by die-hard movie fans. Corbett compared to the comic book guy character in The Simpsons. Greenberg enjoyed reading the negative comments on the Internet Movie Database, whereas Corbett said he would rather take an acid bath than read them. Corbett, who did not see the final film until after it was widely released, said he did not know how the final result would come out. Here's a quote he has. "Part of me is proud and wants to own this movie, promote it, generally celebrate it, and look forward to all the possibilities that may emerge from the experience." And oh, I'm sorry. And an equally real part of me wants to lock myself in a dark room for a month and pretend it never happened. Why the latter? Because the truth is that I had not a bit of control over the final product, and Hollywood does tend to suckify things, often quite badly. And I really have to agree. Starship Dave would have been a much better title. It would have conveyed exactly what it was about. Um, Meet Dave is incredibly generic. The film suffers from uh, no real direction. It seems to meander around and around, taking the story from being about the MacGuffin to being about a ship's mutiny to being about uh, the captain having a love triangle where uh, number three is in love with him, and he's trying to warm up to the mother in order to get to the son so that the son can give him the rock, but a bully took the rock, so they have to get the rock back from the bully. And really, if they had compartmentalized the plot um, into these different mini plots along the way, I think it would have felt a bit more like a journey instead of having all of those kind of extend throughout the movie as long as possible until you're not sure where exactly what's going on, what the characters' motivations are, and the characters themselves seem to not know exactly what they're doing. Um, so yeah, it it's just unfortunate. And just looking on here, uh, in terms of reception, the film garnered mostly negative reviews, with website Rotten Tomatoes showing only 18 reviews out of 92, tallied for a rotten score of 19. I really have to wonder who actually liked this movie. I do have Rotten Tomatoes up on the page here. Let me just look. Okay, so the people who rated it good say, um, I'm sure a more refined filmmaker could have squeezed the premise tighter for sophisticated laughs, but as family angled sci fi comedies go, Dave is actually quite agreeable. Who knew Murphy still had some fun left in him? One could certainly do much worse as far as Murphy's family friendly output goes. Certainly a step up from Norbit, that's true, but anything's a step up from Norbit. Heralding a return to form for Eddie Murphy, this cleverly conceived and executed sci-fi comedy offers plenty of laughs for all ages. The considerable challenge for the filmmakers was to streamline three realities and make each one credible. Three? I'm not sure what third one they're talking about. Likeable sci-fi comedy with some nice ideas and two surprisingly charming performances from Eddie Murphy, though not as funny as it could have been. Well, that's true, but that doesn't make it fresh. After a myriad of disappointing films, Murphy finally appears in a funny, inventive movie. If you like to smile and laugh, this is highly recommended. This person must be easily entertained. It's not every day Eddie Murphy releases something that doesn't make you want to rip your eyes out. In its own way, it is a fun movie. No, it's not. Meet Dave alone may not radically change the course of Eddie Murphy's drooping career, but it is at least an olive branch held out to his audience. But that's better than nil. Ha! Because he comes from the planet Nil in the movie. Dumbfoundingly erratic for the most part, but smart and funny from time to time, especially when Mr. Murphy, in the pseudo person of the spaceship, tries to imitate Earthling behavior. Actually, I think he just comes off as creepy. Really, really creepy. Aside from some unnecessarily crude stereotypes, Eddie Murphy's least painful comedy in years has a certain peculiar charm. The summer popcorn flick manages to deliver more than the standard sci-fi send-up, thanks to a solid supporting cast, most of whom come from TV, that help bolster Murphy's average work. Director Brian Robbins keeps things moving along briskly and maintains a genial air throughout. All that, all that plus an air-conditioned theater makes Meet Dave a good bet for family viewing. They really underestimate families and kids and things, I guess. It's a silly kids movie, nothing more, but for some this may be a chance to meet Eddie. It's about time this guy realized he doesn't need those Norbit prosthetics. Cynics may expect the worst of another Eddie Murphy vehicle involving extraterrestrials. Insert joke about the adventures of Pluto Nash here, but that only makes Meet Dave all the more pleasant a surprise. So the people who actually like this film seem to think that it's worth seeing and it's good because it's just for kids, but just because it's for kids does not necessarily mean that you can get away with writing crap. Uh, Even Bill Corbett admits that it's not that good, and that's largely because he had a lot of his control creatively over the project taken away. Now, what does that mean for you and I, the viewer? If you're actually watching this, it's a little bit of an insult to your intelligence that they go out of their way to not have the story be very realistic. They don't bother having the characters have any kind of um, realistic motives. They're all very contrived and arbitrary, and there are too many plots going on at once where you really need to have maybe subtler suggestions of those plots developing and then have them come up and resolved uh, in workable ways, as opposed to just kind of pulling them out of nowhere. There is absolutely no reason why number three and the captain should be emotionally involved. There's no reason um, why number four should be going uh, from being very uh, heteronormatively straight acting to being very effeminate and you know doing his hair up with gel and decorating his room and dressing in cut off denim and everything. There's no reason why he should make that big a transition. Um, there are subtle references to somewhat humorous things, like the idea for the engineer in the engine room to have a girl he's meeting that he talked with on J-Date. Okay, that's funny. That's something that's actually amusing. Um, but at the same time, that's just because J-Date is a bit of a running gag in movies. So, does this mean that it's a recovery for Eddie Murphy from Norbit and Pluto Nash? No. I mean, I watched Norbit, and I thought it was one of the worst movies I've ever seen. Uh, and that's including Meet Dave, among others. But I thought that Norbit was better written than Meet Dave, and and I still hated Norbit. I still thought it was cheesy and predictable and contrived when it wasn't predictable, and it just kind of did not go in the direction um, that was ultimately satisfying. And I tend to agree with Bill Corbett on this, that it seems like there was too much control taken away from the uh, person who came up with the original concept and the writer that he brought on to help him flesh it out into a full movie. Had they allowed Corbett to retain a bit more creative control over the storyline, it probably would have turned out a lot better, and they would have made a lot more of their money back. Demanding that the title be changed to um, Meet Dave is ultimately one of their big fallbacks in terms of um, in terms of what they did in the production that made it so much weaker. Um, and I tend to agree that in this case, Hollywood really took what could have been a really original and interesting project with some good writing, some interesting character developments, and heck, even Kevin Hart's character could have been actually made more interesting, funny, and endearing, to the point that then when you're at the end and you see these three characters standing and smiling and saying goodbye, it's like, oh, well, yeah, I actually have come to like these characters, and I am sad to see them go. It could have easily gone that route. It was so close on so many levels, and yet in so many other ways, they took all of these good ideas and they piled on good stuff and didn't go far enough with other things in terms of lines, story development, characters that they introduced. They kept the cast very limited down to a few things, but they had so many plot developments that were unrealistic for New York urban setting um, that I just can't help but question, you know, what these writers exactly were thinking. So, yeah, That's enough of my rambles. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Bye.